Good day. Most of this video is going to be devoted to the recent claims that have appeared in the New York Times, BITCHUTE, and the London Times about the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. But before I get to that fascinating topic, let me give a brief account of the state of the fighting, which is the tradition now of this channel. The first thing to say is that we have now had a very interesting and important interview from President Zelensky to CNN, in which he has effectively demolished the story earnestly propagated by some Ukrainian officials and some Western officials as well, and reproduced continuously in the Western media that Bakhmut is a place of no strategic importance. On the contrary, the way Zelensky describes Bakhmut makes it clear that Bakhmut, on the contrary, is of very great strategic importance indeed. And we see that he says, and I'm now quoting from this interview that he gave to CNN, that though Bakhmut does not hold strategic value in itself, bizarre comment, its road connections to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, two densely populated industrial hubs to the northwest, mean those cities be next in Russia's crosshairs if they're able to take control. And then we go on to read some commanders and lower-level officers have questioned the merit of holding Bakhmut amid the rising number of casualties and a growing risk that hundreds or even thousands of Ukrainian troops could get cut off. Notice that this is still in the conditional future, whereas, of course, the Russians, Prigozhin, Shoigu, other Russian officials effectively tell us that that is the present, that those thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are actually cut off. But more about that in a moment. But anyway, Zelensky dismissed those concerns. These are the concerns from the commanders and lower-level officers, say that he had never heard anything like that from his commanders. We have to think about our people first, and no one should be surrounded and circled. This is very important. I had a meeting with the Chief of Staff, which is to say Zaluzhny, and the Chief Military Commanders online, and they include General Syrskyi, and they all talk that we have to stand strong in Bakhmut. Of course, we have to think about the lives of our military, but we have to do whatever we can whilst we're getting weapons, supplies, and our army is getting ready for the counteroffensive. The military see for themselves that we have to stay strong there, despite the fact that Russia ruined the whole city and everything there. And he then goes on to say about how the place has been devastated and the civilian casualties and those sorts of things. But we come back to the point that he speaks about the fact that if the Russians roll into Bakhmut, it will open the road. Russian troops will have an open road to capture key cities in eastern Ukraine if they seize control. This is tactical for us, Zelensky said, insisting that Kiev's military brass is united in prolonging the defense of the city. We understand that after Bakhmut, they could go further. They could go to Kramatorsk. They could go to Slavyansk. It would open the road for the Russians after Bakhmut to other towns in Ukraine in the Donetsk direction. That's why our guys are standing there. So, Ukraine concludes that Bakhmut is indeed of immense strategic significance. It turns out, just as I've been saying on this channel for months, just as many other people have been saying, that Bakhmut is indeed the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Bakhmut, in Donbass. President Zelensky himself now tells us as much, and that means that Ukraine has no option, according to Zelensky, other than to stand firm and to hold Bakhmut regardless of cost, because that's essentially what he is saying. And Zelensky tells us that his commanders, Zaluzhny, Syrsky, are of the same view and have never told him otherwise, that all the rumors, all the reports, all the circulated stories that have been appearing on Telegram channels, Ukrainian Telegram channels, and more recently in the Western media, that Zaluzhny has been pressing him for weeks to pull the troops out of Bakhmut. None of that is true. Now, I think Zelensky this time is telling the truth. I think he is right on every count. Firstly, what he's saying about Bakhmut corresponds not just with my own views, it corresponds with what Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, was saying in that conference that I discussed in my video yesterday. If Bakhmut falls, the road and rail systems in Donbass, central and northern Donbass, fall in effect under Russian control. Ukraine is severely impeded in its ability to move its troops from one part of Donbass to another. It's the Russians, no longer the Ukrainians, who would possess the interior lines in Donbass and who would be able to move their troops around, attacking whatever targets appear most vulnerable. In other words, Bakhmut is very much like Popasnaya, the town in Lugansk region, which the Russians captured early in the summer and which led to a sequence of events which brought about the collapse of Ukrainian defenses in Lugansk region and the eventual fall of the important towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. In effect, that is what both Shoigu and Zelensky are saying. And just to add to that, point that Zelensky doesn't make, but which has been made by several others, including several Ukrainian soldiers, if Bakhmut falls, and if the high ground west of Bakhmut is also captured by the Russians, then they're in a position to overlook Kramatorsk and bring their artillery within easy range of Kramatorsk and possibly Slavyansk as well, putting the entire Ukrainian defenses in Donbass in severe jeopardy. So this is from Zelensky, and as I said, it corresponds with what has been said by others, including myself, for a long time. So if you read again in other articles in Western publications, as you regularly now do, that Bakhmut is of no great strategic significance. If you hear General Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, saying that Bakhmut is of only symbolic importance to Ukraine, well, I think you need to understand that both the Russians, as shown by Shoigu's statements discussed by me yesterday, and the Ukrainians, as shown by Zelensky's comments made in this interview to CNN, both the Ukrainians and the Russians see it otherwise. They both see the Battle of Bakhmut as the most important battle so far in this war, and they both see Bakhmut as the linchpin, as the pivotal place in this conflict in Donbass itself. Now, I have to say that I also believe Zelensky. I've come round to thinking that Zelensky's claim here that there is actually no discord between himself, Zaluzhny, and Syrsky about the way in which the war should be conducted. I think this is right. For months now, almost from the point when Zelensky was first appointed to the post of Chief of the General Staff, which, to the best of my recollection, was around June of last year. Ever since then, I've been hearing report after report, rumour after rumour about how Zelensky and Zelensky are in disagreement about key military priorities. I think there's only one instance when I think this was probably true, and this was with respect to an attempted attack on Snake Island, which was a failure, and which I do believe that the Ukrainian General Staff did actually oppose. But in every other instance, in every other case, I get the sense that the Ukrainian military leadership has been as one with Zelensky in this policy of defending every millimetre of ground and accepting fantastic, enormous losses in the process. And this has been something I found very difficult to understand. It's something that the Pentagon, the uniformed military in the Pentagon, have warned against. But I return to that email I received some time ago by a former NATO intelligence officer, and he made the point that with the decline in Ukraine's combat strength, the steady depletion in Ukraine's combat strength, which has been taking place over the course of the war, Ukraine feels it has no real option but to cling on to every millimetre of territory in the way that it is doing, because in the event that it loses key positions like these in Donbass, then its chances of ever regaining them will become increasingly weak as the war progresses. And I'll come in a moment to what that means about these Ukrainian counteroffensives that we've been hearing so much about over the last few weeks. But anyway, that's what Zelensky tells us so clearly. Bakhmut is of immense importance. So what has actually been going on in and around Bakhmut? Well, the first thing to say is that yesterday and the day before, I was discussing the possibility that Ukraine might launch an attack to try to relieve the troops who are in Bakhmut. Now, there's some dispute about how many troops there actually are in Bakhmut, Ukrainian troops that are in Bakhmut. The latest report, which is from Yevgeny Prigozhin, puts the number at over 12,000, perhaps as high as 20,000. Of course, it's an impossible number to confirm, but that's Prigozhin's estimate. So we've seen a whole succession of different figures from Russian. They said 3,000 at one point, 7,000, 10,000. Now Prigozhin is saying 12 to 20,000. And Prigozhin, in that same comment, emphasized that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut itself are continuing to put up a fierce resistance, that the fighting remains very intense, that despite the fact that the Russians control all the access points to Bakhmut, all the main roads into and out of Bakhmut, they're able to fire on any vehicle that tries to move along those roads. Despite that, there's no sign yet that Ukrainian resistance in Bakhmut has collapsed, despite the confirmed reports now from Ukrainian soldiers. I discussed those at length. The 12 Ukrainian soldiers interviewed by the Kiev Independent, despite all of those reports, that many of the soldiers in Bakhmut itself now despair of victory. They no longer think that Bakhmut can be held or indeed should be held, that it's become impossible to go on holding on to Bakhmut indefinitely. And in fact, I should say that Prigozhin has now had himself filmed, and he's been taking questions and answers from people near another monument in Bakhmut. This isn't the MiG-17 monument that we've been hearing about. It's a monument, a World War II monument of a T-34 tank. He's apparently been there, and he's now said that the entire eastern part of Bakhmut, east of the Bakhmutka River, is completely under the control of the Wagner forces. In fact, we have a dispatch from TASS which tells us as much. It reads as follows: Russian forces have taken full control of the eastern part of Bakhmut. Founder of the Wagner private military company, Yevgeny Prigozhin, said on Wednesday. Wagner PMC units have occupied the entire eastern part of Bakhmut. Everything east of the Bakhmutka River is completely under the control of the Wagner PMC. Prigozhin was quoted as saying by his press service on his Telegram channel. So the Russians, to the best of my understanding, now control roughly half of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are still in control of most of the area to the west of the Bakhmutska River, but we can't. It doesn't look as if this position is tenable for the moment in the long term. Now, what about all of those reports about a Ukrainian breakthrough attempt to try to relieve the forces there? Now, if you accept the truth of what President Zelensky says, that the Battle of Bakhmut is the key battle of the Donbass war, then logically, if you're prepared to go on fighting to retain control of Donbass, then it seems to me that a relief operation to try to rescue the troops in Bakhmut is unavoidable. I mean, that has to follow the logic of what Zelensky said. And in fact, there were reports yesterday appearing in several Telegram channels, Russian and Ukrainian, that the Pentagon has authorized Ukraine to use around 50%, around a fifth of the troops and Western equipment, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and that sort of thing, assigned for previously set aside for this famous spring offensive, about which more in a moment, that the Pentagon has allowed or permitted Ukraine to use a fifth of the men and material that were going to be used for this offensive in order to carry out some kind of push to try to break in and relieve the pressure on Bakhmut. Well, we'll see. Now, there are some problems. The weather in and around Bakhmut is changing. Apparently, temperatures are rising. There's apparently more rain and wet. And the result is that the ground is becoming increasingly soft. The open fields and country lanes to which Ukraine has been reduced, if it's going to try to get supplies into Bakhmut, well, I've always been skeptical about the prospects of using those fields and country lanes, but it seems that before very long they're going to become effectively impassable. And I presume that means effectively impassable, even for an offensive, a counterattack to try to break into Bakhmut itself. And I say that there's been all kinds of claims about how Western tanks, because they stand higher on their tracks than Russian and Soviet tanks, are somehow better in dealing with muddy conditions. I'm very skeptical about that claim, by the way. But anyway, I've heard all kinds of claims like that. I understand that does not apply to the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Apparently they have rather narrow tracks, so they're not particularly adapted or suited to use to send through the mud. So that would suggest that Ukraine must either wait several weeks for the ground to harden up before it launches its counterattack, which I think would put the garrison in Bakhmut in an impossible position. I mean, it would asking them to keep fighting at the current level of intensity for weeks on end until the ground hardens, I think is to ask altogether too much of these soldiers. All the alternative is, presumably, to try to launch this offensive along those two roads. Now, if Ukraine does that, then, of course, that offensive along those roads puts the Ukrainian vehicles that would be carrying out the offensive, the tanks, the infantry fighting vehicles, the soft-skinned lorries that must provide the ammunition and the fuel for those heavy vehicles, it exposes them to Russian artillery fire, and it concentrates them in particular places where they would be very, very much at risk from that Russian artillery fire. Now, I say all of this, I'm not any kind of military tactician, but, unless I'm missing something, that seems to me to be so. So, to put it mildly, we are talking, therefore, about a very high-risk operation indeed. Unless, as I said, Ukraine engages in some sort of counter-siege in Bakhmut, which, as I said, would take weeks, which might not be fast enough for the troops held in Bakhmut. Now, I would say that programs that we did on the Duran, and which I've done in my channel, on this channel over the last couple of days, saying that the Russians are saying that the situation in Bakhmut is now essentially a cauldron, that is in fact a cauldron, that the Ukrainian troops are now caught in a cauldron. Well, they have produced some rather strong reactions in some places. And in fairness, we did see that Zelensky interview with CNN in which he seems to imply that the troops in Bakhmut have not yet been fully encircled and that there isn't yet a cauldron in Bakhmut. But I have to say, all the other reports, including reports from Ukrainian soldiers, effectively confirm the Russian claims that that there is in fact a cauldron now in Bakhmut. That most of these troops, Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut, are, as the Russians claim, operationally encircled. They can flee as individuals or in small groups, perhaps without orders. One wonders how they would be received when they arrive back at their own lines, assuming that they get through. But attempts by Ukrainian troops to pull out of Bakhmut or to supply the troops in Bakhmut until that breakthrough attempt takes place, well, as I said, they are now all but impossible. And when the ground softens further, they'll become more difficult still. So I continue to say that the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are in cauldron. Now, of course, there might be an attempt to, as I said, pierce this cauldron, and the logic of what Zelensky says makes that an attempt to do that probably likely. But until that happens, and unless it succeeds, I'm going to continue to refer to it as a cauldron. Anyway, it's not only in Bakhmut that that there are events going on the battlefields. It's not entirely easy to get a full picture of all that's happening across the rest of the battlefronts on Ukraine. We don't, as I've said, have a colourful character like Yevgeny Prigozhin on the other battlefronts giving us a constant commentary on about what the Russians are doing in any one particular place, other than Bakhmut itself. But there were reports last night and this morning that the Russians have gained further ground in their advance on Avdiivka. And maps that I've seen of Avdiivka also show a sort of pincer movement, a creeping Russian pincer movement around this important town, smaller than Bakhmut, but a town very close to Donetsk, a place where, as I said, the Ukrainian military have their strongest positions close to Donetsk, and a place which the Russians are now bombing with their air force. And I've discussed in previous programs how gravity bombs are apparently more effective in demolishing fortifications than artillery is, and perhaps it's because the Russians are now able to bomb the Ukrainian military in Avdiivka that they've partly been able to make this progress, which they do appear to be making. So, some evidence of Russian advances in Avdiivka, and one gets the impression that Russians, again, are exerting severe pressure in Avdiivka, and perhaps they're working towards an encirclement of Avdiivka, as I believe they're doing with Vuhledar further to the south, and perhaps with Kupiansk further north. And on the subject of Kupiansk, this important town on the Oskol River, which the Russians captured in February last year, but which Ukraine recovered over the course of its successful Kharkiv counteroffensive in September. I'm getting reports that Ukraine has pulled out most of the remaining civilians from Kupiansk, or at least the part of Kupiansk that's located east of the Oskol River. And it does look as if, as I said, we're likely to see a significant battle for that place as well. So pressure all along the lines now, but Zelensky himself admitting that the key battle is Bakhmut, and that the situation is such that if Bakhmut falls, well, in time, the rest of Donbass falls as well. Before I conclude my discussions about Bakhmut and come onto the topic of Nord Stream, let me quickly say that there's been some commentary. An anonymous NATO official has been going around telling people that Russia has lost something like 30,000 men trying to capture Bakhmut, and that Ukrainian losses are only about a fifth of that, somewhere in the region of 6,000, and that the Ukrainians are killing Russians at the proportion of 5 to 1 in Bakhmut. I am going to make a guess that that Western official is a British official, and I'm also going to say that I have a view as to who that official might actually be. But as I don't know, I'm not going to name him. All I'm going to say is that that's absolute fiction. It bears no relation to any information I'm getting from the situation on the battlefronts and on the Battle of Bakhmut itself. All the indications are, on the contrary, that it is Ukraine that has suffered by far the heaviest losses trying to defend Bakhmut, and of course the fact that the Russians have this overwhelming artillery advantage in Bakhmut explains why it is Ukrainian losses that are so much greater than Russian. In fact, I'm going to suggest that if you reverse the ratios and assume 5 Ukrainian soldiers killed for every Russian fighting in the Bakhmut area, you're probably not that far from the truth. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation on the battlefronts today. Now let's get on to this discussion about Nord Stream. Now, about a month ago, Seymour Hersh, the world's most famous investigative journalist, a person with a record going all the way back to his exposure of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. He's provided information about any number of other stories. The Abu Ghraib story, he was one of the key people who provided information over the course of the Watergate scandal. Anyway, this most famous and most celebrated, or at least until recently, most celebrated of investigative journalists, provided a lengthy, detailed, highly granular account of who and how the Nord Stream pipelines were attacked. And Seymour Hersh told us that it was an operation authorized by the President of the United States, agreed with a small group of people in the center of the administration, Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, Assistant Secretary Nuland, and CIA Director Burns. He explained, or at least this was his account, this was Seymour Hersh's account based on his sources, information provided to him by his sources, that the Norwegian government was also involved and provided significant assistance. He also said that the people in the energy industry were fully aware of what actually happened, and he also explained that the operation was carried out in a way that circumvented Congress, that instead of US Special Forces being used, divers were taken from a diving school in Panama, I believe, and that they were brought, and it was that they who carried out these explosions. And Hersh has provided us, as I said, with details, he's provided us with names, he's provided us with detailed accounts of how the operation was carried out, and by whom, and anyway, it's been an extremely detailed account, as I said, from the most famous investigative journalist of modern times. Well, yesterday, simultaneously, in what I can't help but think was an orchestrated move, stories appeared in the New York Times, the German newspaper Die Zeit, and the London Times, which gave a radically different account of how it all happened. Apparently, it wasn't the operation that Seymour Hersh describes. President Biden did not authorize it. Nuland, Burns, Blinken, and Sullivan weren't involved. The Norwegians weren't involved either. The Navy diving school in Panama, they weren't involved. Congress wasn't circumvented. It was all carried out by a somewhat mysterious pro-Ukrainian group. Or perhaps it was carried out by a somewhat mysterious pro-Ukrainian group. Because if you read the New York Times article, which is based on our old friends, the anonymous intelligence sources, well, they admit that the intelligence pointing to it being carried out by a pro-Ukrainian group is unconfirmed, apparently not fully reliable. So it might have been carried out by this pro-Ukrainian group, or perhaps not. And then we go on to read in ETHEREUM and in the London Times a rather curious story, which is not provided anything like the same kind of detail by the New York Times itself. There we read that it was all carried out by this pro-Ukrainian group, which, by the way, the New York Times says might have been Ukrainians, or it might have been Russians, far-right Russians, presumably like the ones who recently carried out the attack in Bryansk, people who were opposed to President Putin's government. So, we're not even completely sure. The New York Times and its intelligence sources are not even completely sure about the ethnicities of the people who carried out these attacks, this attack on the Nord Stream pipeline. But Die Zeit and the London Times apparently know better. They say that the operation was handled by, was carried out at the instructions and with the funding of a wealthy Ukrainian individual. The team who carried out the attack, which numbered 6 and included 2 divers, carried it out from a yacht, which was apparently hired, I believe, in Poland, but which apparently sailed to the area from Germany, from a German port. And it seems that amongst these 6 people, one of them was a woman, though quite what her role in this whole affair was, it's not really very clear. So there you have the 2 alternative accounts of the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. This is, remember, one of the largest, one of the most elaborate, one of the most strongest and most powerfully built pieces of infrastructure located quite some distance under the sea, in the Baltic Sea, a sea very heavily patrolled by various navies, the Russian Navy, the navies of the NATO powers. Anyway, they're all there. And of course, we have one account from the world's most famous investigative reporter explaining how it was carried out by 2 NATO governments, the United States and Norway, how it was carried out by trained divers, how it was carried out at the bidding of the White House, how it was carried out under cover of a NATO exercise, which open sources confirm was being conducted in that vicinity at roughly the time when the explosives would have been planted. Anyway, that's one account. Or then you have the alternative account, which was that it was an act of private enterprise carried out by 6 people in a boat. Now, I leave it to you, dear viewer, to decide which of these 2 accounts you think is the more plausible one. I would say that the information about the attack being carried out by these 6 people with a boat would be an awful lot more convincing to me if it were the case, as the London Times says, that the identities of these people and of the Ukrainian businessman, wealthy Ukrainian who authorized the mission, who set up the mission, if it is indeed the case, as the London Times says, that these people's identities are known, it would be a lot more convincing to me if these people had been arrested and taken for questioning. After all, what they carried out was an extremely serious criminal act. But there's absolutely no sign of that at the moment. Personally, and I'm choosing my words extremely carefully now, I find this whole story, that it was all done by 6 people and a yacht, very, very difficult to believe indeed. Anyway, let's move on, however, and think through the implications, because of course we have to now go back to the New York Times article. It's a very interesting article indeed, because it's such a complicated article in so many ways. And I think the best discussion of it has been made by Joe Laurier for Consortium News. And Joe Laurier's piece makes some very interesting points, and essentially Joe Laurier makes the point that even though the article, the New York Times article, says that in fact there's no actual evidence that any actual Ukrainian government official was involved, or that President Zelensky was involved, the article actually insinuates otherwise. It gives every reason to think, or at least it gives strong reason to think, that the United States does in fact believe that Ukraine, or at least the Ukrainian government, was involved in some way. It appears to accept the possibility, for example, that the article says that, Ukraine has kept its decision-making processes opaque, that the United States doesn't always understand how decisions in Kiev get made. It says that the Ukrainians don't always consult with the United States before they make those decisions, that some of these decisions which are made and which result in the Ukrainians carrying through with various projects, well, those things are counterproductive. The United States would disagree with some of the things that some of these decisions and some of the acts that the Ukrainians have carried out, that this is actually counterproductive. And to quote specifically from the article, officials said that there were still enormous gaps in what US spy agencies and their European partners knew about what transpired, and that but officials said it might constitute the first significant lead to emerge from several closely guarded investigations, the conclusions of which could have profound implications for the coalition supporting Ukraine. Any suggestion of Ukrainian involvement, whether direct or indirect, could upset the delicate relationship between Ukraine and Germany, souring support amongst the German public that has swallowed high energy prices in the cause of solidarity, in the name of solidarity. And the article goes on to say, despite Ukraine's deep dependence on the United States for military, intelligence and diplomatic support, Ukrainian officials are not always transparent with their American counterparts about their military operations, especially those against Russian targets behind enemy lines. Those operations have frustrated European officials who believe that they have not measurably improved Ukraine's position on the battlefield, but have risked alienating European allies and widening the war. The operations that have unnerved the United States include a strike in early August on Russia's Saki air base in the western coast of Crimea, a truck bombing in October that destroyed part of the Kerch Strait Bridge, which links Russia to Crimea, and drone strikes in December aimed at Russian military bases in Ryazan and Engels, about 300 miles beyond the Ukrainian border. But there have been other acts of sabotage and violence of more ambiguous provenance that US intelligence agencies have had a harder time attributing to Ukrainian security agencies. One of those was a car bomb near Moscow in August that killed Daria Dugina, the daughter of a prominent Russian nationalist. Kiev denied any involvement, but US intelligence agencies eventually came to believe that the killing was authorized by what officials called elements of the Ukrainian government. In response to the finding, the Biden administration privately rebuked the Ukrainians and warned them against taking similar actions. And the point is that this comment appears to distance the United States from all the famous covert operations that Ukraine has carried out over the last couple of months. It says that they've not managed to achieve anything. They've all been counterproductive, including the attacks on Engels, the attacks on the Saki air base, the attack on the Kerch Bridge. But Ukraine was involved in every one of them. And the implication is that even though the United States doesn't, or pretends that it doesn't, definitely know that the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian officials, were involved in this attack on the Nord Stream pipelines. It's at least possible, it's likely that they were. And we start to see how there's a pattern building up here of blaming Ukraine for the attack on Nord Stream. Now, what are we to make of all of this? As I said, I've already expressed my own skepticism about this whole story. As I said, that the attack was carried out by 6 people on a yacht. Let's ask, however, why this story is appearing now. Well, the first thing to say is I have no doubt at all that it is appearing now in response to Seymour Hersh's article and his various interviews, the various interviews that he's been giving, which have been gaining gradually more and more circulation and more traction. Somebody took the decision, or so it seems to me, that with Seymour Hersh's account beginning to gain traction and it being discussed at Russian initiative at the level of the UN Security Council, no less, with people like Ray McGovern and Jeffrey Sachs actually giving evidence to the Security Council decisions. Anyway, it became necessary to provide not just denials of Seymour Hersh's story, but to provide an alternative explanation for what happened. And that's how we've got to this story of the 6 men, or rather 6 people, 5 men plus a woman in a boat carrying out this attack. But at the same time, there has to be some care not to implicate any particular government. So none of the NATO governments must be implicated. So you mustn't suggest that this was an operation involving a NATO government. And that leaves Ukraine, given that Russia, the investigators have firmly ruled, apparently, Russia out. So that must leave Ukraine. But You can't openly identify Ukraine. You can't say that it was President Zelensky and his officials that authorized this attack. Because, of course, if you do, then, as the New York Times articles tells us, that might create problems in the relationship between Ukraine and Germany. So therefore, you have to downplay any official Ukrainian involvement as well. And that, I would suggest, is what leads us ultimately to this very threadbare story of the 6 people and the boat. Because you have to distance Ukraine from this operation, you have to distance every NATO government from this operation, you have to distance the White House from this operation and the United States. So that leaves you with the 6 people and a boat. And as I said, I find this story impossible to accept. I will wait and see, however, if any of these 6 people are arrested, if the man who is supposed to be funding this operation is arrested, if they're held for questioning, if we learn more about who they are and how they carried this out and the name of this yacht. If we're given all that information, well then I might revise my view. But up to that point, my skepticism is, I think, clear, and you see the process anyway, whereby we've arrived at this rather threadbare story, and why there might be political imperatives to do that. But as Joe Laurier has correctly said and correctly explained, the fact that the New York Times article is full of insinuations that Ukraine at an official level was involved, and it's gone through that elaborate sequence of telling us about all of these various operations, and the fact that the United States apparently thinks that these operations, even successful ones, like the attack on Saki, for example, were counterproductive for Ukraine, that they didn't help Ukraine materially on the battlefield, but that they might have alienated European allies and threatened to widen the war. I mean, it paints a picture of a Ukrainian government that might have authorized this attack, is capable of doing it, is chaotically run, and is fundamentally irresponsible. And is that the kind of ally that you send $100 billion of weapons to, give vast amounts of financial aid for? Is that what you do with an ally like that? And as Joe Laurier, I think, correctly says, what this article in the New York Times does is that it doesn't just distance the Biden administration from the Nord Stream attack, which is one of its clear purposes. It also, in effect, distances the Biden administration from Ukraine, or at least from the Zelensky government. And that is clearly one of its purposes. It's telling us that Zelensky and his officials are potentially unreliable. We don't have any evidence that they were behind this attack. Perhaps they weren't, but we can't be sure that they weren't, given the many crazy things of which we strongly disapprove that they have done in the past. So, why would the United States be looking to distance itself from the Zelensky government at this point? Well, I can't help but think that it is because of the deteriorating situation on the battlefields, which is exactly, of course, the same point that Joe Laurier makes. It's a situation, we have a situation where Ukraine is losing Bakhmut. I mean, this is a battle that's been fought for months. It's taken a long time for it to reach its resolution. But the Russians now control around half of Bakhmut. They've effectively encircled the Ukrainian troops, the remaining Ukrainian troops that are trying to defend Bakhmut. The Ukrainians might try and launch a counterattack to relieve those troops, but the prospects of success, it seems to me, are dimming. And it could anyway be the case that even if the counterattack succeeds and there's a breakthrough into Bakhmut, that's not the end of the battle, that the battle will continue, that Ukraine will suffer more losses, and more likely than not, far more likely than not, in the end, Bakhmut will be taken anyway. And we also learn that Ukraine itself recognizes that this battle of Bakhmut, which is being lost, is decisive. Zelensky himself tells us as much. This is the decisive battle of the war. That's why it's been so fiercely fought. If Bakhmut falls, Donbass is likely to fall as well. Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, thinks this. Zelensky thinks this too. He says that his staff, his senior commanders, Zaluzhny and Syrsky, think it as well. So things are looking very difficult. And remember, if Bakhmut falls, and if that does lead to the fall of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka and all of these other places, there are no major obstacles left between the Russian army and the east bank of the Dnieper River. The Russians can push forward all the way to the Dnieper, arriving next on the east bank opposite the key industrial city, the key Ukrainian industrial city of Dnipro, and perhaps gradually creating a situation where the whole of Ukraine east of the Dnieper becomes undefendable as well. So we see how important Bakhmut actually is. And the battle of Bakhmut is being lost, and the United States is aware of the fact. And we've also seen more and more reports over the last few weeks about the doubts about the likely prospects of this Ukrainian counterattack. Ukraine has been pushed by the Western powers to launch its counteroffensive in this spring, because the situation on the battlefronts in all other respects is going badly. And we've had warnings to Ukraine, repeated warnings, that it only has until the summer to turn things round with this counteroffensive. But though Ukraine has given a major shopping list of the kind of equipment it needs in order to carry out this counteroffensive successfully, the West has fallen short. It can't supply all the tanks Ukraine has asked for. It can't supply all the infantry fighting vehicles. Those that it has supplied are a hodgepodge of different machines from different NATO countries. And above all, Ukraine is critically short of artillery, and it is running out of shells. And I've been reading more and more reports now about the disastrous state of Western arsenals, how it would take around a decade for Britain to repair, to rebuild its arsenals to the level that they were before the start of the Ukraine war, before our Secretary of State, the British Secretary of State, Ben Wallace, started to ship every kind of piece of gear that he could lay his hands on to Ukraine. Same applies to other NATO countries. Apparently Germany is in an even worse state than Britain, as people like General Fard and General Kuyat have warned, and as the Bundeswehr Officers Union has also warned. And of course, there's now further reports from the United States as well. We've had lots of bold and brave statements about the United States building up its artillery forces, its increasing production of shells. I've been discussing, Brian Belletic at the New Atlas has been discussing, this takes time. It can't be done quickly. And in fact, again, we're hearing that it's now going to take years for the United States to replace its rapidly depleting arsenals of shells and weapons. So, on top of that, on top of all of this, we now have a further crisis looming on the horizon, much greater, more dangerous crisis for the United States in some ways than the war in Ukraine itself. And here I have to reference a brilliant article by Eve Smith in Naked Capitalism, in which she discusses the catastrophic inability of the United States, or perhaps the neocons who have been leading US policy, to understand that there are limits to US power. The first two paragraphs of this are so insightful that I'm going to actually read what Eve Smith has written. A vivid scene came in my first year Harvard MBA course, Business, Government and the International Economy, taught in my section by George C. Lodge, son of Henry Cabot Lodge, by the way, a very famous US diplomat of his period. George Lodge said he still remembered the day in 1968 when he realized that there were limits to US power, that we could not fight a war on poverty, send a man to the moon, and fight a ground war in Asia at the same time. The lack of that insight still seems widespread inside the Beltway, with belief in American omnipotence renewed by the fall of the USSR and then the further decline of Russia in the 1990s. Under a story initially published with a page-wide banner headline, "The US is not ready for the era of great power conflict," and this is an article in the Wall Street Journal, the article curiously admits that it is the US that has been fomenting these conflicts, and even though the URL banner on the article proper reads, "The US is not yet ready for the era of great power conflict with China and Russia," the piece treats Russia dismissively in passing and treats escalating with China as a perfectly reasonable thing to do, not just now. And Eve Smith is absolutely right. Only I would say one thing. Some people in the Beltway, the neocons, may not understand that there is a limit to US power, but other people, specifically I suspect in the uniformed military, do. And they must be looking at the depletion of their arsenals. They must be looking at the rapidly deteriorating military picture in Ukraine itself, and they must be also looking with growing disquiet at the rush towards a conflict with China and the increasingly strong words made by China in response. And you can understand why they must be putting growing pressure to try to put final distance between the United States and Ukraine, why they must be warning the administration, or at least the more rational people in the administration, that this conflict in Ukraine has resulted in overcommitment of US prestige and resources in what is likely to be a failing cause. And that, I think, is the point of this article in the New York Times. I'm going to say straight away, I've been thinking about this article a lot. I'm not convinced that it is the administration itself, the key decision makers, Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, all of those people who've come to a decision that they must provide this alternative narrative to Seymour Hersh's, and at the same time publish an article that appears to prepare the United States for a pivot away from Ukraine. I think this is a further response from the realists within the United States government, the uniformed military, people in the finance and business sector, some of the industrial people, those people. And what makes me think that is the way in which this article, this New York Times article, catalogues all these adventures that Ukraine has carried out. The attack on the Saki air base, the truck bombing that destroyed part of the Kerch Bridge, the drone strikes in December against Ryazan and Engels, the murder of Daria Dugina. Basically, this almost leads to me like a rebuke from the realists of the policy of the administration. They're telling people in the administration, the neocons, you've hitched the US chariot not just to a losing cause, but to a losing cause led by crazy people who don't consult properly with the United States, who keep their decision-making secret, who have this visceral hatred of Russia, which leads them to do bizarre and dangerous things. And we need to extricate ourselves from this mess, because the entire position of the United States, as a result, is at risk of becoming threatened, and our European allies, who are already having to bear an awful lot, are becoming alienated. So I think this article in the New York Times is a very important article. It shows that we may be close to a pivot by the United States away from Ukraine, which, given the extent of Ukraine's dependence on the United States, would mean, to be very clear, a resolution of this war, which would amount to the end of the Ukraine which we have known. And I think that needs to be said clearly. But I think it's also, as I said, reflective of this massive internal battle that is taking place within Washington between the various component parts of the US governmental and political system as the fight over Ukrainian policy takes shape and follows its course. If I'm right in that, then I'm going to also suggest that Seymour Hersh's article has played a huge role in all of this, because it might mean that some people on the realist side in this argument going on in Washington have realized that Seymour Hersh's article has put the administration, the Biden administration, Biden himself potentially, in a weaker position where, yes, they can come up with this story of the 6 people and a boat, but at the same time, even as they appear to be helping the president, they're actually challenging the fundamental bases of his own policies. Well, we will see how this all works out over the next few days and weeks. Now, Joel Laurier makes the absolutely valid point that I think that the sudden appearance of all these articles in Washington, in Germany, and in Britain, covering the 6 people and a boat story is hardly a coincidence, and that it presumably accounts for that rather mysterious trip by Olaf Scholz to Washington and his meeting with Biden that I've discussed in recent programs. But I think that I've said enough for today in this, again, rather long video. As I said, complex issues in some ways to discuss. More from me soon, and in my next program, I'm going to return to the China issue. I was intending to, by the way, in this video, but of course events overtook me with the information about the Nord Stream story that has just come out. So more from me soon, and that's where I end today. Thank you for joining me, and just to remind you, you can find all our videos on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and also you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Remember to check out our shop, and last but not least, if you've liked this video, tick the like button and check your subscription to this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.